Next up on our list of priorities is water. Now recall that even under fairly ideal circumstances, if you're not consuming an adequate amount of water, you can die within 3 days. So it becomes fairly important, typically beyond that shelter and maybe even fire situation. So the way I look at it is in a fairly typical survival situation, you make it through that first night, you build your shelter, get a fire going just to keep that body warm enough. You make it through that first night, and on that second day, you need to be looking for water. So when I address water, I break it down into 3 pieces here. First, we need to locate a water source. We need to disinfect our water before we consume it, and we need to figure out a way to carry it, generally speaking. Now, carrying we'll leave till the overnight. It'll be a bit easier to look at when we're together in person. So we'll leave that behind for now. But number 1, of course, is locating a water source. Ideally, you find a creek or a river or even a lake that has more than enough water than you'll ever need. Typically, on average, we could say that you need at least a gallon of water per person per day. And that's under pretty good circumstances. If things get a lot drier, that really jumps up, or if you're putting out a lot of sweat through physical activities and things, that can jump to 2, 3, 4 gallons of water per day that you need. So we need ample amounts of water. Number 1, when locating water, is which direction does water run? Down, right? So generally, consider heading downhill. Look low, you might say. So look at the terrain, the geography, and try to guess where the water is going to run to. Okay? Technically, if you keep heading downhill and keep heading downhill, and then when you reach a point and it turns one direction and goes downhill, keep going downhill, and eventually you'll find water. Now, depending on where you are, that could take miles and miles and miles, but eventually if you head downhill, you should find water. Number 2, sort of the opposite of that. Look high. So especially in very arid environments like deserts, water will collect, and possibly the only standing water you'll find are in these little potholes, like in the rocks. So where over time, rocks have cracked or worn away, and there'll be little dishes. In really arid environments, those serve as almost the sole water source for a lot of wildlife. So look high, especially what might be above your head or out of visual range. Don't be afraid to get up on top of that mesa or those rocks to start looking around from the top. Number 3 is vegetation. Look at the vegetation around you. It'll give you a lot of signs and clear indicators with how much water there is. It can be as simple as what types of plants are growing there. If you find really succulent, luscious plants, they need a lot more water than very desert type plants. Right? Generally speaking, also, deciduous trees that have broad leaves that fall off in the winter, require a lot more water than coniferous trees with needles. And if you look closely at those, you'll see they have a waxy coating, and they've kind of adapted over time to not evaporate off their water, to not give up their water as easily. They tend to fare very well in dry environments, which is why we see so many coniferous trees here in the Rocky Mountains and more deciduous trees out, say, in the eastern part of North America where it's a lot more wet. So just generally looking at the vegetation. Now within that, if you stop and really narrow your focus, for instance, here in the mountains, we tend to have a lot of those conifers, but we also have a couple of species of deciduous trees that are clear indicators that there's water nearby. Those are things like aspen and willow. They love to grow along those waterways, or you'll find aspen groves where there is no standing water. But they need a lot of water, so what that's a sign of is that there's water in the ground. So looking for the signs that the vegetation is giving you will indicate how much water, or at least that there is water in the area. Closely related to that could be, is the ground moist? Is it muddy? Which is a pretty clear sign we don't really have to think about. But in terms of those aspen groves, what you may find soon after starting to dig is that the ground feels very moist and it gets muddier and muddier. And the 4th thing here is what I'll refer to as place-based signs. So these are the things that are very peculiar to a specific place you are. So One of the ones that gets thrown around a lot is in desert environments. Cacti, hold on to their water a lot more. You can actually gain access to water by cutting open a cactus. So that's the kind of thing that's going to be very place-based, very dependent on where you are. I mentioned a moment ago aspen trees here in the Rocky Mountains. You could also sort of consider this in that same category. So those are the kind of things that, as you travel somewhere new or live somewhere new, start to get a feel for what the individual signs of that area are, that there's water nearby. So let's talk about disinfecting your water source. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about why we disinfect. I think it's fairly widely understood. In a nutshell, there's all sorts of wee beasties in your water, protozoa, viruses, bacteria, that if you take those in, they'll make you horribly sick. And if you are vomiting and have diarrhea, you could be dead a whole lot quicker than 3 days because you're losing a huge amount of moisture or water through those outputs. So it becomes incredibly important to disinfect, to treat your water to the point that it's safe to drink. So there are, in my mind, 4 main ways to disinfect your water. So here's that scrap of paper time. Take the next 10 seconds or so and just brainstorm the 4 main ways that you can disinfect water. Go. Okay, that's a bit more than 10 seconds. So here are my 4 main categories. Number 1, boiling your water. Number 2 are what we call halogens, named after the family of elements on the periodic table. Number 3 would be filtering your water. And number 4 is using solar radiation from the sun. But I subdivide that into the ultraviolet portion of that, or simply using it as a heat source. So here we go with talking about these more in depth. Accompanying this lesson, you'll find here on the website a chart put out by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, that is a really nice graphic to look at with these different disinfection methods placed against the things we're trying to treat for, those protozoa and bacteria and viruses, and then which are more and less effective, how effective they are. So I'd really encourage you to spend a good 10 minutes or so really looking at that over. There's a lot of text, but just try to digest the basic piece of it, and there's a nice visual with kind of which are more and less effective. So after you finish watching this video, definitely take a look at that chart. Number 1, boiling. Hands down, the best thing we can do to treat our water is to boil it. It'll kill all organic matter, viruses, bacteria, everything. So hopefully that's as simple as you taking that metal pot that you brought with you, filling it with water, and putting it on a flame. Okay. It's that simple. Boil it, done. Right? It begs the question, of course, that I get a lot, which is how long do you boil water for? Years ago, they used to say 15 minutes, 12 minutes, then it dropped to 7 minutes, and then 5 and 2 and 1, and just hit boiling. Personally, I'm a just hit boiling kind of person, but I also recognize you can't really drink boiling water. So if you're going to expend the energy to boil your water and then the time to get to boiling, you might as well boil it for 5 minutes, just a really good rolling boil, because it still has to sit there and cool for an hour or more anyway. If it's cool out, or if you can then sit that pot in a cold creek, it'll cool that much faster, but of course you don't want to contaminate that water with more dirty water out of the creek. There's another technique though, that if you don't have a steel pot, it's called hot rock boiling. As the name is fairly self-explanatory, you're basically heating up some rocks near your fire and putting them into your water source. Now that can take a couple changes of rocks or very large rocks, but in time, if you take enough hot rocks, put them in your water and pull them out as they cool, you'll elevate the temperature of that water to boiling. It's pretty well documented on the plains of North America as well as many other places around the world. The native people, this is how they boiled a lot of their water. Heat those rocks, put them in. A couple of tips here is be wary of where you're collecting your rocks. You really want to avoid rocks that have or might have moisture inside of them, So especially avoiding rocks near or in a creek bed or someplace that may have flooded recently. Best case would be you use rocks that have shown sign they've already been in or near a fire. The danger to taking a rock that has water in it and putting it on or near a fire is that you will boil the water inside that rock. And as that boils, turns to a gas and expands, it can actually explode the rock, blow up the rock. So then you have pieces of rock flying to make your day even worse than it already is. So be very careful about which rocks you're using, and then also don't place them deep into the fire. Place them kind of near the fire, still too close that you can't keep your hand there, it's too hot, but outside the fire itself. Heat them up, use a couple of sticks or make some tongs to pick up the rocks and drop them in your container of water. So that's hot rock boiling. Same thing in terms of amount of time. You're still boiling the water, you're just adding the rocks to it. It's sort of like if you take a cast iron skillet off the stove, it's hot, put it in the sink and run water in it, that water boils instantly. So imagine instead of putting the water in the pan, you're putting the pan into a big thing of water and heating the water that way. So hands down, boil, 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 if you have that option. The next technique over here are the halogen family of elements. These are things like chlorine and iodine. You can go to the store and buy them in little tablet forms or 2-part drops or a little tincture of iodine, 2%. Put it into your water, a quart or a gallon of water, shake it up, let it sit, and the chemicals kill off the stuff in there. Chlorine and iodine, they are technically poisons, so we really want to not overdo it with how much we're putting in there. My favorite of these is to go to the pharmacy, and in like the over-the-counter section you can buy a little vial of tincture of iodine, 2%. It's pretty inexpensive for a fair amount of it, but you'll see a little skull and crossbones on there because it is in fact a poison. But you really, when you're only putting 8 or 10 drops in an entire gallon of water, you're dispersing that enough, it's not really going to affect your body. So unfortunately, halogens are really the only thing on here that we can't fake in the backcountry. We can't improvise. You really have to have them with you. You can't be digging up chlorine or iodine out there in the wild. So, so those are the kind of thing you want to carry with you to rely on. I like the iodine, but it is a liquid, which is hard to repackage, whereas if you buy some of those little tablets, you can take 2 or 3 or 4 tablets and put them into a homemade survival kit and leave the rest of the bottle at home. So it's easier to pack that smaller in the tablet form. But of course, it's a consumable resource. So even if you pack and plan enough to treat, say, a gallon of water, in that first day that you're worrying about your water, you need to be figuring out what your next plan is. How are you going to, say, boil your water or filter your water? So it's a good short-term, immediate kind of backup plan, but you need a plan B after that as well. So filtering your water. All sorts of cool, fancy contraptions out there, from sort of your Brita on your faucet at home, or the pitcher, to the pump backpack filters, to a couple years ago some products came on the market, brand names being LifeStraw and Sawyer makes a filter now that uses a slightly different technology. A lot of them use either charcoal or like a porcelain filter, but the newer ones use a fiber kind of straw in there that filters out the fine stuff. Filters, you'll see on that CDC chart, one of the big drawbacks is around viruses, and that's because viruses are so small that they can slip through even the finest made filters. So that's the big drawback here to filters. But basically what it comes down to is like similar to a coffee filter. You just have a very, very fine mesh that as the water goes through it, it just strains out all the stuff we're trying to get out of there. If you want to extend your filter, you really want to try to pre-filter your water, even pouring water through a bandana or a t-shirt or something, to get all the stuff you can see out of there. Generally, the stuff we can see isn't the problem. We'll see sticks and dirt, and that's not going to hurt you. But it's the bacteria and the viruses that we can't see that does the damage. But if you leave those big chunks in there, they're going to clog your filter. So you got to get that out of there first before you're treating it for health. So pour through a bandana or something, and then run it through your commercial filter. Or, so you didn't carry that filter, we can improvise one in the backcountry, which is a cool process, cool project to go through here. So think outside the box on this one. But basically what we're going to do is take charcoal out of your fire and crush it really, really fine, pack it together to pour water through. So how you do that, what you use to do that, what container you put this in, really just think outside the box on this one and be creative. I'll diagram kind of a fairly simple one. First would be finding that natural resource, the plastic soda bottle, and turn it upside down, cut the bottom off. You're left with this. Now I like to put some sort of plug here in the bottom, like I'll take a bunch of grasses, pull a whole handful of grasses, tie them up, and jam them in here so you get this plug just to kind of stick right there. Then you want to add a layer of sand in here. So gravel can work okay, but the finer the sand, the better. And note the distinction between sand and dirt, right? Or humus or anything organic. You really want fine sand. Beach sand would be ideal. Here in the Rockies, if you look around like ant hills, ants love to bring up this gravel from underneath. You'll find some fairly fine gravel and sand in there. So a layer of sand. Then you're going to pick up those black charcoals out of a cooled fire. You don't want to be grabbing the hot ash and coals, but after they cool, collect a whole bunch of those white coals and crush them just on a log or a stump with a rock. Just grind them really small. You want the finest graphite or charcoal powder dust. And then start packing it in here. Really take your time and just pack it really tight. The finer you grind this and the tighter you pack it, the better a filter it'll be. So you can see the majority of what we're going to put in here is that charcoal. So color code our diagram here. It's the charcoal, this is the sand. And then we generally finish this with another thin layer of sand on top. So why the sand? Sand is much, much more coarse than the charcoal or even any of a variety of other inorganic materials out there. But really all they're doing here is keeping the charcoal from washing through the plug in the bottom, and the charcoal is so buoyant that if we didn't have a layer on top, when you pour the water in, the charcoal will just float. So the sand kind of brackets the charcoal from both ends is the idea there. You could, on the bottom here, you could put a bandana or a piece of t-shirt or anything else in there as well. So grass plug, sand, charcoal, sand, and then it's important to leave a big reservoir up top here, because you want this filter to work very, very slowly. You want to pour water in and have it take a while to trickle through here and eventually start dripping out. You want this filter to drip. If your water is running through, you're not filtering anything out. So what that means though is you need to fill your reservoir and let it sit. So walk away, go do something else. I like to, if we're using a plastic bottle, I'll punch holes and tie like a bail handle, piece of string or something. Over here you can hang it over a branch on a tree, top it off, pour water in there up to the top, let it sit, go about working camp chores, whatever you need to do, gathering firewood, come back in 30 minutes, an hour, and just keep topping it off. And then you'll of course want another container below here to catch this in. So it takes time, but just throughout your day, just be topping it off, topping it off, topping it off, and you can produce a fair amount of water. Generally speaking, if you have options in terms of your container, taller is going to be better than wider, because it gives you more room for the charcoal and then more reservoir space. If you have it really wide but only a half an inch of charcoal, it's not going to filter nearly as much. So taller is better in that case. So that's a basic filter. Again, be creative, see what else you can come up with to use and to improvise. And our last section here then is using sunlight, using rays of the sun. So I divide this into two categories here because they work in two very different ways. Number one, with ultraviolet light. When you use UV to sterilize bacteria and so on, it's not actually killing anything. So there's some products out there, SteriPen is a commercial version. It comes with a little ultraviolet light bulb in there, runs off batteries. You fill up your water bottle, stick it in, swirl it around, and it sterilizes what's in there. So it sterilizes it, it doesn't kill it. But the thing with bacteria that makes you sick is you consume bacteria and then it reproduces like crazy in your gut. And then it takes away or it takes over the good bacteria and just makes you sick. So what it's doing is stopping the bacteria from being able to reproduce. So it's stopping that which bacteria, the mechanism bacteria uses to make you sick. But you're actually consuming live bacteria. So you can buy one of those commercial products. I used to carry one for a while, but I stopped because it ran on 4 AA batteries and that was heavy, and you're always worried about the batteries running out. So, but they're decent, never had any problems with it. Another option is, again, you find that soda bottle, and there is a technique here called SODIS, S-O-D-I-S, short for solar disinfection. If you take a clear 2-liter plastic soda bottle, fill it with water, put the cap on, and just sit this in the sun, period. That's it. Depending on where you are, the latitude you're at, the elevation, how much sunlight the place you are gets, this can take anywhere from an hour or two to several days, but it will sterilize, disinfect the bacteria that are in here. So this was investigated by some European scientists with the goal of being able to give a lot of people in Africa clean drinking water, usually using only what they had access to. And so, for better or worse, they had access to like Pepsi bottles and things, and so they could empty them out, put water in them, put them up in the roof in the sun, and treat water to have clean drinking water. So I believe all the science was done with a 2-liter soda bottle. I don't see why I couldn't work with a smaller one, but the science is based on a 2-liter. So pretty cool technique, very simple. But again, we can't really improvise it with totally primitive methods. We need that bottle. The other option is to use the sun as a heat source. And so what you'll hear me talking about this from a standpoint of using the sun, but you could actually use the heat from a fire to accomplish a lot of this kind of thing as well. So what we're getting out of this is we're actually going to be distilling the water in a primitive sort of way. So pretty much the most pure water you can get is distilled water. There's a couple of methods. One would be what is called a solar still. So you'll see this diagrammed a lot in military survival manuals. You start by digging a hole in the ground, and then you need a clear sheet of plastic. So again, hard to make if you don't have one, but a clear sheet of plastic. So you want to dig your hole a little smaller in diameter than how wide your plastic is. Then you're going to stretch the plastic across the top, but weighting it down ever so slightly in the middle with a little pebble or something. The idea here then is the sun comes out, hits the plastic, and superheats the air underneath here inside that hole. So we're creating the greenhouse effect here, and it's heating the temperature here, or raising the temperature inside the hole here, which is going to suck moisture out of the ground. It's going to vaporize it. So the water that's in the ground as a liquid is going to evaporate, come out into the hole and rise. But when it hits the plastic, it condenses. So it turns the water again, and then runs down the plastic to the low point and drips off. And we need one other thing here, and that is you need some sort of water catchment device, i.e. cup, bowl, whatever you have, to put in the bottom there. So as the water drips off, it lands in the bowl. A couple other things you could add to this. The downside of this is each time you want to drink out of the bowl, you have to disassemble the whole thing, reach in and get the bowl. Or if you have the luxury of having packed a straw, like a long piece of surgical tubing or something, or a straw of, say, a Camelback or something, when you put this thing together, you can simply build the straw into it as you go. So you've laid it under the plastic, goes in and lays into the bowl. So what you can do is you show up, come back to this every once in a while, lay down and just drink through the end of the straw, and you'll just be drinking it right out of the bowl. This pure distilled water. Probably going to be pretty warm, but you can just drink it straight from there. So this is one that you really have to try, I think, to appreciate or not appreciate. It is very dependent on where you are in terms of the amount of water you can actually get from this. So worth giving a shot to at least have the experience of knowing how that works. The other way that's very similar, not quite as labor intensive as this, is what's called a transpiration bag. So locate a tree, a bush, specifically, one with a lot of foliage. You really want to find one of those deciduous trees, the broadleaf trees that's going to lose its leaves in winter, not a conifer with needles on it. So locate, say we find a branch that's got tons of foliage on here, like this. We're going to take a clear plastic bag. You could improvise that with a sheet of plastic, but let's say in this case we take a clear plastic bag. You're going to wrap it over this whole branch, and again you want to weight down kind of a corner or the end, little pebble or something in there. Sun comes out, hits the plastic bag, same idea, greenhouse effect, sucks the moisture out of the branch here, condenses on the bag, eventually runs down all sides and starts to collect in the bottom. The nice part with this, you can actually take the bag off after a while, and it doesn't adversely affect the tree or the plant here. You can just give it a shake and it goes back to living the way it was before. So again, another one that you need to try to just get a feeling for how much water this actually produces, but you can do this again and again and again with, in this case, basically just a plastic bag. You want to tie it off tight here to isolate the air inside there. So both of these are going to use the heat of the sun to evaporate the water, which is why we can use this the same way. So the challenge then, the question is, if you are on a deserted island with nothing but salt water around you, how do you get clean drinking water out of salt water? We can't drink salt water. It'll dehydrate us. But if we use a combination boiling and distilling, so you evaporate off the water, the salt will stay in your container, but have it condense on a roof of some sort and let it run off into another catchment bowl, you can distill water from seawater. So that's a bit on water disinfection, on locating and disinfecting water. Give some thought to how in a wilderness setting you would carry water. So it's one thing if you are set up beside a creek or a stream. What happens when it comes time to move? If you actually need to move overland, how are you going to bring that water with you? So consider how you're gonna carry, improvise a container, or what you could pack ahead of time with you. So, all right, it's a bit about water. Check out that CDC chart, and let's move on.